David Korten is a celebrated author, co-founder of Yes magazine, and a leading figure in the struggle to create a new sustainable economy to replace what he calls the suicide economy we have today. He's also a founder of BALLE, the Business Association for Local Living Economies, president of the People-Centered Development Forum, and co-chair of the New Economy Working Group, which was created to formulate and advance a new economy agenda. David Korten began as a fully certified member of the establishment. Air Force officer, Stanford PhD, Harvard professor, Ford Foundation executive, regional advisor on development management to the U.S. Agency for International Development. He lived overseas for about 30 years, running business schools and helping to administer U.S. aid. And then he concluded that the Third World's crisis of increasing poverty and inequality, environmental devastation, and social disintegration was created by the policies that the United States was promoting, both at home and abroad. He came home to Seattle to teach that the prospect of a sustainable human future demanded profound change, not in the Third World, but in the First.
Well, as you suggest, I grew up in a very conservative town and assumed I was going to go back and spend my life in running the family business as the eldest son. But in my senior year at Stanford, I was a very conservative young Republican at that time. But I ended up taking a course on modern revolution to find out what is this threat about to our American way of life. And I learned that revolutions are caused by poverty, the frustrations of poverty. So I decided I was going to spend my life working abroad, taking the secrets of U.S. business success to the poor countries of the world so they could get rich and happy like us and forget about the revolution nonsense. But that led to a life beyond anything I could possibly have imagined as a child. Living in Ethiopia and Africa, Nicaragua and Central America, Philippines and Indonesia and Southeast Asia, and really experiencing the world in depth and the variety of its cultures, but also with time coming to realize that the real sources of the poverty that I set out to address, to end, were really caused by a lot of policies that are promoted by the United States and that ultimately led back to now what we see as a focus on Wall Street and Wall Street corporations and their drive to pillage the world. And essentially coming out of business school and out of an organization background, I had been trained, educated in how to design corporations to maximize profits, which, we grew up believing that is the key to prosperity for everyone. But I kind of took it the next step ultimately and figured out how that very drive and that very design, institutional design, was leading to the destruction of the world, our environment, our social fabric, and as well the economy. So that was the key to my shift from from my roots.
Well, there's a great deal of intellectual bravery in that, it seems to me, and it also implies that you keep your eyes open, which many people in the same position clearly didn't. They live inside a kind of a bubble, right?
Yeah. I guess I've long had a bit of a rebel sort of instinct built in.
Yeah.
But I've also, my rebel days came much later in my career, starting in the late 1980s, in terms of really beginning to question the system. And, by that time, we were fairly financially comfortable. And, I've had a deep sense that that those of us who enjoy that privilege of financial independence really have a responsibility to speak truth. But I also, I have a passion for learning. I really want to understand the world. I want to understand what makes it work. And, in some ways, it's ironic that that a lot of that was stimulated by my business education training, where we were taught to look at a situation, figure out what the systemic source of failure on the shop floor or in a marketing program or whatever. How did that relate back to the systems and structure of the organization? Where did that fail? Now, of course, in business school, we're supposed to keep that within the box of the enterprise. And I managed to escape the box and look at the entire world from that perspective.
I hadn't thought of that, but you know, right, that kind of business school background, if you take it out beyond the business school, is an incredibly powerful tool.
Yeah, and of course I was, you know, my business school education was in the case method tradition. So instead of listening to lectures, you know, for each class we would be presented with a case study, a business problem. And so we'd have to absorb the data, think through how the pieces of the data fit together, and then come up with action solutions. So it was a wonderful education, and you know, I couldn't more highly recommend the case study business education, but just be sure you go in with your being very clear on your values and hold true to those throughout. But the actual skills involved are extremely useful.
Yeah, it speaks very well of that technique, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And you came to the conclusion that what you were in is what you've called a suicide economy. It's a very striking phrase.
Yes.
Tell me about why it's a suicide economy.
Well, in simple terms, it's an economy that is designed around making money. That is the measure of every decision. It is the measure of the success of the firm. It's what Wall Street financial markets are looking for. And it turns out that people have discovered that, you know, one of the quickest ways to make money is to push down wages so people can't maintain a family, they can't maintain a home. In the long run, that's disastrous economically, but in the short term, it's highly profitable. To mine the resources of the earth, to push, I mean, one frame I come to now is, you know, the rapid extraction and consumption of fossil fuels, essentially to organize to work in opposition to Earth's biosphere, the thin layer of life, the living fabric of the planet. And you begin to realize we have built a whole civilization around working in opposition to nature. And the current focus is using fossil fuel subsidies to carry that forward to an extreme, and it is ultimately destructive of the biosphere. So if you really understand the structure, the dynamics, the values that define our economic system, it is driving us toward collective suicide as a species. In some ways you can think of it as an act of collective insanity. So part of the incredible inquiry is, why do we as a supposedly intelligent species get us into this incredible trap?
And why do we? I mean, let me phrase it another way. I mean, the people who are driving this bus also have children, also have grandchildren, also breathe air, also, you know, and don't seem to either to see it or to care what the direction in which they're driving us. A lot of it traces to our culture. We humans are actually are wired to develop a set of shared beliefs. It's what allows us to act as a social unit. You know, traditional tribal societies, they grow up with a shared culture that allows them to act as a unit in relation to one another and nature. Now, for a whole variety of reasons, including the self-interest of some of our more aggressive power holders, we have developed a whole set of cultural beliefs that we're all embedded in that support this absolutely destructive system. And part of it is the belief that money is wealth. You know, that's a huge illusion, because I mean, there's nothing esoteric about this when you break through that money is nothing but a number.
a number on in our current situation, mostly numbers on computer hard drives that we can't even see without the computer intervening. So it absolutely cannot be recognized by anything in nature. And yet we've built our power system around that. Now, once we're buy into the illusion that money is wealth, it's then very easy to buy into the idea that those who are making money are creating wealth. So therefore, if the economy is making money, it's creating wealth, which then benefits all of us. But in fact, once you recognize the reality, you see that particularly within our current Wall Street economy, the whole system is geared to destroying real wealth, destroying or expropriating real wealth by the very richest people on the planet, all to increase financial assets, which are nothing but these numbers on a computer. So that that is one piece of a cultural trance. Now, we've also...
That's a good phrase, cultural trance.
Yes.
Yeah.
We have also been conditioned to believe that it is our human nature to pursue our own immediate short-term benefit, short-term advantage. Now, so, any system or mode of organization that assumes that we have a capacity for cooperation or sharing is therefore dismissed as totally unrealistic, idealistic. Now, if you really understand the science of the human and our processes of maturation and our psychological dynamics, you recognize that the individual who thinks only of themselves and their short-term interests, cares nothing for the well-being of others or for the consequences of their actions on others, which is the value of Wall Street, they can be clinically described as psychopaths. That is the clinical condition of the psychopath or sociopath. And we have literally developed a culture that celebrates the psychopath over the healthy, morally and emotionally mature human being.
So it really is a cultural trance and a collective form of insanity. Huh?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. You describe in one of your books how money is created. I mean, your comment that money is an illusion, I think, is one that we want to maybe linger on a moment, because I don't think many people I think many people suspect that there's something really wrong there,
yes,
without really knowing what it is. And the creation of money is a fascinating thing. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, and it's so amazing. It is the most important aspect in many ways of understanding our society and how it functions. And yet, we're never taught where it comes from, really. And most extraordinary, I mean, most of the business school curriculum is built around money in one way or another. I do not recall any of my professors ever mentioning that money is a system of power.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, in terms of how it's created, it's, in the kind of standard system in the United States, it starts with the Federal Reserve, which creates money with an accounting entry. And the audit that was done of our Federal Reserve, audit of its actions following the September 2008 financial crash, they created something on the order of $13 trillion either to hand out to various banks and corporations or to back worthless securities. And literally nothing more than a computer keystroke to create that money. Now, that creates the base that flows into the banking system, and then, without getting into the complexities of this, with a 10% reserve requirement on deposits, the banking system, as that money flows through the system, can create 10 times as much money as what can multiply what the Federal Reserve puts in by 10 times. Now, part of what's been going on in these Wall Street games is they've figured out all sorts of ways to create little pieces of paper that they trade with one another. These get, in a sense, assigned a market value because other people will buy them, all these derivatives and things. Those in turn become assets, collateral that can be used to borrow against, to further leverage. That money flows into things like housing mortgages to inflate the housing bubble or inflate the stock bubble, which again creates more, in a sense, phantom assets that create more collateral. So the system just keeps playing on itself, creating more and more financial assets, which give the few people who control those assets ever more control over what remains of the real wealth of the world.
I think you said in one of the books that typically, just going back to the sort of the middle of that process, the bank makes a loan,
yeah,
and that's simply if it has 10% of it has 10% money in a sense, and real money in the first place, and it's then allowed to create 90% on the basis of that, right? And just by essentially declaring, I am lending you this money, and now suddenly the money exists.
Yeah.
Am I overstating this?
Well, here's the embarrassing moment. No, you're stating it exactly as I wrote it, and as a lot of people have written it. That particular interpretation, though, I've learned is not accurate.
Oh, okay.
You know, the individual bank can't simply make it. It must have, some source for whatever it loans, either deposits or borrowing from other institutions. But as the bank issues a loan and that money flows, against its deposits, that money flows into another bank and becomes the reserve for that bank, which then gives a loan, and that moves into another bank. And so mathematically, the way it plays out is the banking system multiplies the money by 10 times.
Yeah. As it moves from bank to bank. In effect, it grows as it moves between financial institutions.
It turns out it's kind of a key distinction, because it doesn't mean, it means that the power of the bank is actually a lot less than what we would assume. Mm-hmm. And it allows us to recognize that that what's gone wrong is during the process of deregulation, when I grew up, I have no idea how this was in Canada, but I would guess it was a fairly similar situation. When I grew up, most of our states had unitary banking laws, which meant that a bank could not have any branches. Each bank was an individual unit in the community where it was located, usually owned by somebody in the community, and it's a financial institution, takes in savings and makes loans in the community. And these banks were rarely, if ever, engaged in speculating on pieces of paper. They were making long-term investments with people that they knew. There were investments in productive activity of one kind or another. Now, through the process of deregulation, we took off those constraints. So the banking power, the power to create credit as a system, resided not in Main Street, but in Wall Street. And as it moved further and further away from the community, and the restrictions against speculation, banks engaging in speculation, were lifted, the whole system found it could generate profits much more quickly by forgetting about productive investment. And even when people are buying corporations these days, if it's a Wall Street interest, a private equity fund, it's not buying that company so it can improve its real productivity and service to the community. It's buying it because they see some opportunity to strip some assets, to play games with its price so they can sell it off for a profit. And usually those exchanges end up actually destroying real value in order to create financial value. So as deregulation allowed the centralization and concentration of that capacity to create and manage money, it not only shifted power away from people and their communities to Wall Street, which acts in relation to the United States like a colonial occupier, an alien occupier, to strip wealth out, not to create it. But it shifted the whole value system and orientation at the same time. So that process of deregulation plays out as a perversion of where power should reside and a perversion of values.
And that takes us right into one of the great loops, I think, in what you write, which is the relationship between money and government, or between Wall Street and government in the case of the United States. But because in a sense, as it gets bigger, and as Wall Street assumes more power, it's able to in effect buy the government.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Is that a fair statement?
Very fair, very straightforward.
Okay.
Yeah, buying politicians, and of course the price of politicians has been going up enormously. And the politicians are so dependent on TV advertising, which the networks sell to them at, some would maintain inflated prices, which makes them very dependent on big money to fund their campaigns. And anybody that says that a politician that gets millions of dollars from corporations to fund their election campaign, that they're not influenced by that, is really being a little naive.
And then you've got this thing that in their origins, I think corporations were supposed to be formed, perform a particular service, and then fade away. But now we've got them being treated, I mean, they've been considered to be virtual persons for a long time. And then tell me about the Citizens United decision, because we haven't had that in Canada, but it was really quite striking here.
Well, it's actually a very checkered history of the corporation. The reference to corporate charters being very selectively given and only for a specific purpose and often for a specific time. That was in the early days of the United States. After the Revolution, which was partly a revolution against the British Crown corporations, particularly the British East India Company. But the actual history of the modern corporation traces back further. You put it at various points of time. To me, the clearest is 1600 with the chartering of the British East India Corporation, which was chartered to exploit colonial territories. And its design was structured to serve that purpose. It's interesting that it also, as I understand it, part of the motivation on the part of the king was that, you're beginning to get a little call for democracy and a little uppity. Some of the lords were saying we ought to at least have a democracy of the elite. Of their elite class. And so that was constraining the king's power of the purse. So he discovered that chartering a corporation, putting a little personal money in, he could create a flow of revenue that was not within the reach of Parliament.
There's an interplay between the corporation,
yes,
which is a creation of the king, and the king, right?
And partly as a diversion around democracy.
Yeah. That's been
and as a way of exploiting colonial territories.
Which brings me to one of the things that I've really enjoyed about your work is there have been a number of points at which you've brought up on the hook big ugly fish that I kind of knew were there and could a little bit have described, but not nearly as clearly as when you brought them into the boat. And here's one of them. When corporations rule the world, you talked about an alliance between the world's largest corporations and most powerful governments, backed by the power of money, to integrate the world's national economies into a single, borderless global economy in which the world's megacorporations are free to move goods and money anywhere in the world that affords an opportunity for profit without government interference.
Yeah.
Is that truly where we're headed?
Well, it's where we are. It's where we are.
Well, we still have residual national borders, though. But I mean, this is really.
We have residual national borders, but in terms of the movement of, you know, corporations can move across borders a lot more easily than people can. And, you know, these supposed free trade agreements, you know, they are themselves a bit of a scam, because a big part of what is written into those treaties are guarantees for corporate rights. So in agreements like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, you know, if an American corporation wants to come do something in Canada that Canada decides would be harmful to its environment or might make its people sick, and it says you can't do that, the corporation can sue Canada for the profits that it claims it lost because you restricted its freedom. And of course, Canadians do the same thing to the United States, and Mexico's also part of the game. So, you know, understanding, you know, the kind of supplements, the details of these agreements is really important to understanding why that absolute, you know, why those agreements are extremely pernicious to the public interest, and why they ultimately give corporations more rights than governments. Because it's about protecting the rights of corporations essentially against the interests of people, nature, and the governments that we supposedly elect by democratic process to represent our interests. But the rules say, oh, no, they can't do that. Corporations have a right that transcends the rights of people. Now, the Citizen United decision of the Supreme Court, which is also very revealing about our legal system, you know, essentially puts an extraordinary limit on the ability of government to regulate campaign contributions, and essentially says that that corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money from their treasuries to influence elections, the election of politicians. And all based on our Bill of Rights in our U.S. Constitution that are supposed to be protecting the rights of people. But because of this strange legal quirk that, you know, in law, the nature of a corporation is that it can act as a person in terms of holding property and suing and being sued and so forth. Particularly the Supreme Court, which turns out to be almost an entirely political institution. The law is interpreted almost exclusively by what at least in our current situation, by the political loyalties of the Supreme Court. And our Supreme Court currently is controlled by a majority of people who come from the plutocracy and see their role as to protect the interests of plutocracy in the corporate sector. So, you know, this just opens up our elections to a flood of money way beyond anything that's been involved before. And so for us ordinary people who have an ordinary income, you know, our ability to participate in those elections, which are decided more by money than by votes, becomes extremely limited.
Yeah, it's a very anti-democratic situation.
Very anti-democratic.
Now, what we've been talking about here so far is almost entirely what you've called the phantom economy, or phantom wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Let's talk a little bit about the alternatives to it. So, the real economy, or
yeah.
the real or real wealth, would take the form of a very different economy, which
yeah.
you're very actively engaged in fostering.
Yeah, which, you know, I mean, the common everyday term is the Main Street economy. And I think, you know, I think this distinction between the Wall Street economy, which is the phantom wealth economy that operates in global cyberspace to extract wealth, is at the one extreme. The Main Street economy is where people live and work. It's Main Street businesses that are owned by people in the community. They might be individual proprietorships, they may be cooperatives, they can be worker-owned owned corporations. It would take many forms, but the difference is defined very much by ownership. You know, the Wall Street corporations are generally publicly traded, which means their shares are traded often in microseconds in the public share markets, which completely separates the owner from any meaningful engagement in the enterprise, in the corporation. Now, you know, when I grew up in a small town and my family had a business, you know, we had the whole family there. They were connected to the business. We lived in the community. Our health depended on the health of the environment. It depended on having local employment and a strong local economy. So we had a very natural interest in how our business contributed to the overall well-being of the community. A publicly traded company that has no roots in a community comes only to extract as much wealth as possible, to push down wages as far as possible, to mine whatever resources it can get its hands on. And if that community collapses, or if all the trees are gone, or all the oil is sucked out of the ground, then they go to the next community and replay the scenario. So that, you know, the thing I advocate is we need to be focused on creating Main Street economies that are owned by real people who live in the community. Now, the other piece, of course, is our relationship with nature and our ultimate need as a species to bring ourselves into balance with the biosphere. Total human consumption working in balance with the biosphere. Which ultimately means if we're really gonna do that and live reasonably well, instead of working in opposition to the biosphere, trying to overwhelm it, shape it to our will, mine it, we need to learn to mimic its structure and its dynamics. Now, if you understand the biosphere as a system, it is global, but it is locally rooted everywhere. It has this incredible capacity of all the organisms, species that comprise the biosphere, of capturing water, nutrients, and energy right at the specific place where they live, recycling, repurposing that energy, and then integrating it back into the overall system, which is a totally different structure than our global economy controlled by corporations that are, you know, moving food, water, energy, and so forth from one side of the globe to the other, creating enormous dependence and completely isolating us from our intimate connection with the place where we live and with the health of its natural systems. You know, to me, a kind of defining practical example of this is the difference between industrial agriculture, where you use heavy equipment, lots of oil, diesel, to smooth out the land, to create a monoculture, a mono environment, control the water, control the nutrients, control every aspect of the life process, and defeating all the local micro-adaptations. The difference between that and ecological or biodynamic agriculture, which is about using the natural processes, planting diverse crops, using the natural cycles. You know, the really good organic farmer, you know, knows every little microenvironment on his or her property and learns how to work with those cycles and adjust to them to make maximum productive use of the natural processes of their soil, water, and its nutrients. So there's two extremes, and this kind of captures the the way in which we need to fundamentally rethink our relationship to the biosphere.
To accomplish the sort of transformation you're talking about, you're going to have to confront some very powerful forces that do not want any such such transformation. Right?
Right.
How do you do that?
Yeah, there's a lot of elements to it, but it starts with changing the story. We've been raised to believe that the system we have is the only possible system. Mm-hmm. Certainly here we're continuously told, well, this capitalist system may have its flaws, but the only alternative is a communist system where everything's run by communist bureaucrats and you give up your freedom and there's no innovation and people are inevitably going to be poor and so forth. And we're also told that the capitalist system is synonymous with personal liberty, with democracy, and with universal prosperity. Now, it turns out that story is not true. The original definition of capitalism, when the term was coined, was a system in which a few people own everything for their exclusive personal benefit and to the exclusion of the interests of the majority of the population, including virtually all of the people who do productive work that creates real wealth. So that's a definition of capitalism that fits perfectly our existing system. Now, if you further understand the nature of that system, it's very clear that it is not only the enemy of democracy and of personal liberty of anybody other than the corporate CEOs, it is also the enemy of the market. Because the drive of these Wall Street corporations is to establish monopoly control over resources, money, intellectual property, and just about anything else that they can establish their property rights to. And the whole purpose of that is to extract monopoly profits, to amass the concentrations of political power that they can use to rewrite the rules to further support their pillage. This is the ultimate anti-market, anti-democracy institution. So surprise, what is the real alternative? It's a local economy in which you have broad participation in the ownership of productive assets, in which you have one person, one vote democracy, in which you organize your economy in a way that looks a whole lot more like a farmer's market of people in the community producing and exchanging goods and services. Looks a whole lot more like that than it does a global economy centrally managed by Goldman Sachs, Walmart, and Monsanto. Now, part of this also is understanding that when you get the global society and the global economy organized under massive global corporations, that the economy, the people within that corporation, that does not operate like a market, and it certainly doesn't operate as a democracy. That the people at the top can hire and fire at will, the people who are employees of, depend on, or the people in the communities in which these businesses are located that depend on them for their well-being, they have absolutely no recourse or say. So penetrate these myths with a story of the truth, including the truth of what the real alternative is. Now, another key piece of the process is creating the new reality from the bottom up. So what we're seeing is people all over the world organizing at a local level to rebuild their local economies, rebuild their local food systems, rebuild their local finance, every aspect of their local needs and economy. That begins to create the new system from the bottom up. And the larger change strategy is one of emergence and succession, or displacement. that as more people wake up to the fact that their interest really lies with buying from local farmers, supporting local merchants, and we begin to strengthen our local enterprises, rebuild the different elements of the food system and so forth, we're giving people more choices as to where they work, where they shop, and where they invest. And each time we make one of those choices in favor of our local economy, we're literally pulling our life energy and support away from the Wall Street economy and into the Main Street economy, which we also refer to as local living economies, because they're creating living communities in a living natural environment to support living families and living people. All, of course, is distinct to corporations that might look more like zombies than true living persons.
So the first step is change the story and basically show that there is an alternative and that the alternative is more humane, more productive, more human.
Yeah.
And then start to actually produce that economy by...
From the bottom up.
From the bottom up.
And then the third element is change the rules to shift the legal power from the Wall Street corporations to the local Main Street economy. So in essence, the overall frame, particularly in terms of thinking about policy, is about shifting power from Wall Street to Main Street.
I think when you get to the third one, that's the point where I think to myself, now at some point, the corporations are going to wake up and say, there's some bad stuff going on here from our point of view, and are likely to take, and they're, as I think you also point out, they're based on ultimately being willing to resort to violence.
Yes.
Aren't they going to respond violently?
They're certainly not likely to go peacefully. But one of the things that is a source of hope is, at this moment we're seeing the emergence of this Occupy Wall Street movement, beginning to develop sustained mass protests that is actually focused on the source of the problem and the failings not only of the United States but also of the world. That is a very hopeful sign. Now, we're already seeing the plutocrats and their representatives are going berserk. I mean, class warfare, anti-American. In fact, what these people are saying is, we want something for the 99% of us that are not served by this system. We want our country back. We want our government back. We want our economy back. Now, it's going to take that mass mobilization ultimately to alert the politicians to the fact that if they don't get on board with changing the rules in favor of people, we're going to get new politicians.
Yeah, but really the only hope is that those people just keep coming and coming and coming, that you can arrest them and you can lock them up and you can do this and that, but there's just more and more waves, which is the way what we saw with earlier periods like the Vietnam thing and the race issue and so on.
And it's interesting. We've already had some police violence against these demonstrations. But one of the things, if there is enough resentment, enough resistance within the society, that police violence simply sparks more resistance because it reveals the reality of the loyalties of the system. Now, part of the strategy, it is absolutely essential that the protesters, the resistance, maintain disciplined nonviolence. Partly our objective here is to create a nonviolent system, and as peacemakers like Gandhi have pointed out, the means must be consistent with the ends. You cannot create a peaceful society through violence.
It's fascinating to see what appears to be American, suppressed, depressed Americans learning from Egypt.
Yeah.
Like this is in a way the American Spring, isn't it?
Yes.
Or it may be, but
there's a beautiful irony in this.
It is, but it's quite lovely. It's quite beautiful, really.
We're all learning from each other as we we wake up to the reality of our of our situation and of our possibilities.
Yeah, it is. The scary thing is, I think you also referred at some point to a deeply frightened electorate that's susceptible to right-wing demagogy, and there's a real danger there, I would think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the demagogues, of course, recognize that, and so they cultivate fear and play to it. And that kind of suppresses our more human brain and our more human function, and pushes us down to our the reptilian core of our brain, the most primitive aspect of our psychology. So part of us also recognizing that as well, that our capacities for critical thought, our capacity to work cooperatively with one another reflects our higher human nature and possibility.
Yeah. I suspect there's another piece of it here too that ties in very closely, and that's the environmental thing, that people getting really frightened about the conditions that sustain life, and recognizing that massive corporate control is a real threat to all forms of life on Earth.
Yeah. It's so amazing waking up to the fact that our lives depend on the health of the biosphere. This is another part of the distortion that conventional economics has brought in. By economic theory and the way we price things, in theory, if we have enough money, we don't need the environment because we can substitute something for nature. I mean, that's a piece of the collective insanity. Because there is no substitute in life for life.
There was a sign in Copenhagen that somebody who was there told me about, and it said, "There is no planet B."
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting. I recently gave a talk to the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics, and within the economics profession, this is the group that is really focused on the environmental issues. But they've actually got sidetracked too by efforts to put a price on the environment. Now, within the logic of economics, that makes sense. If you price the environment in your decisions, you're at least taking it into account. But that misses the point that underlying that very calculation is the presumption that if you have enough money, you don't need healthy natural systems. So that's, it's an incredible fallacy, logical fallacy.
Yes. Well, and it builds into even the alternative, the very assumptions that are so damaging in the mainstream.
Yes. Yes. It plays right in, and then of course the people who have the capacity to create the most money, then also they can buy the environmental resources. You put a price on them, so okay, I'll pay your price and take the resource.
And that is giving reality to what you've already pointed out as an illusion, the whole money.
Yeah. It's all based on illusion.
Another thing that I noticed that's in much of your thinking about this is the need for better indicators. That, in a sense, we don't really understand. It's easy to mislead us about what this real situation is if we don't have indicators and measurements that take into account some of these other things, right?
Yeah, well, this is, in terms of places where we can intervene to begin to shift the system. The indicators that are primary metrics for evaluating economic performance are the GDP, gross domestic product, and our stock market price indices. Now, these are both basically financial indicators. And they both lead to, the stock market is the clearest, that's a measure of how well the Wall Street is doing and the very wealthy are doing. GDP is a little bit more subtle, but basically it's a measure of how fast money is flowing through the economy, the exchange of goods and services. Now, the only folks that are almost certain, given the system, to benefit from circulating more money through the economy are the Wall Street corporations and banks, because they control the money. Now, I began to understand the implications of this when I was working abroad in poor countries, and I realized, you know, the World Bank and IMF, the big agencies, would measure development progress by people moving up the income ladder to, you know, move from less than $1 a day income to more than $1 a day income. So see how much progress we've made. People are getting richer. Well, what they don't mention is that those people that they're talking about used to live in subsistence economies, which, you know, offered modest benefits, but people were growing their own food, meeting their own needs within their village economy, basically without the use of money. Now, what this increase in income reflects is pushing them off of their means of subsistence, which they control themselves, and pushing them into dependence on the money economy, and thereby the people who control money. And if you look at the actual quality of their life in terms of their access to food, to basic medical care and so forth, they're actually a whole lot worse off as they make a little bit more money than they were before they got into that trap. And in many respects, what we measure as growth in GDP is part of that same phenomenon. You know, if you put your children in a paid daycare center rather than take care of them yourself, that increases the economy, but it weakens the family. You know, if everybody's working, spending their day working at two poorly paid jobs, both husband and wife, that's good for the economy, but it's terrible for family. And it's also terrible for the community because we're not, you know, doing the voluntary kind of things or even engaging in the kind of social interaction that is essential to maintain the fabric of a caring community. So, you know, one of my economist colleagues notes that we'd do better to treat the GDP as a measure of the cost of achieving any given level of real well-being, rather than using it as the measure of benefit, increased well-being. And I think there's a lot of logic to that.
That's a very interesting take on it, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was reminded as you were speaking of Ron Coleman, of GPI Atlantic, who's been working on genuine progress indices for a long time.
Yeah.
Saying at one point that if you marry your housekeeper, that's bad for the economy.
Yeah.
If you divorce your wife and then hire her back as a housekeeper, that's good for the economy.
Exactly.
It's quite bizarre, isn't it?
It is. It's truly bizarre. And part of waking up. I mean, I actually, I mean, there's a lot of good work going on in Canada on this issue. My criticism of the GPI is that it's still built around financial indicators. At least it you know, it takes into account the costs. But I think to really make the breakthrough, we need to move to almost you know, a dashboard of non-financial indicators. Real indicators of the health and well-being of our children, our families, our communities, health, both physical and mental health of individuals, the health of the natural environment. As soon as we reduce it to a financial metric, we begin to enter into some distortion of reality and of real values.
It's true, although it does allow you to bring back into the calculation things like the value of unpaid labor and volunteerism, and, you know, and the costs of obesity and stuff.
And
that
that's a lot better than the than the plain GDP. But but it's still subject to distortions.
Yes. Well, and there are some real measurements too, like in Bhutan, for example. They're terribly pleased, and absolutely rightly so, that life expectancy has gone up from 48 to 66. Well, that's a real metric.
That's a real metric.
And that's non-metric, non-monetary. Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally non-monetary.
Yeah. If I had to summarize where David Korten is coming to in all of this, it would be that the responsibility for the future is up to us, right? That we have to be, and you said we are the ones we've been waiting for. We have to be the ones that we were waiting for, right? Nobody else can do it.
Yeah. And basically, the leadership's going to have to come from outside the establishment. And it's interesting. I've even, I've really been giving some thought to, okay, what about those people within the establishment who are waking up to the fact that this system is going badly wrong? Now, if you're the CEO of a big corporation and you realize that your company's doing a lot of bad things that may be profitable but are bad for the society, if you start acting on that within the company, you're going to be fired one way or another. But if you, in a sense, step outside of your insider corporate role and maybe get together with a few other buddies who may be having the same awakening and begin to go public that, we need to change the rules so that we corporations have to operate in a way that is more conducive to the well-being of the society. And particularly if those rules might lead toward breaking up these big concentrations of power into smaller companies that ultimately sell themselves to their employees or to the communities in which they operate, then we're beginning to talk about real change, which people from within the system can help us move forward. But otherwise, it's those of us who are working outside the establishment, organizing our local economies, organizing politically, sharing the message about the new stories. That's where the starting point comes, and that's going to be the real foundation of real change.
David Korten, author, activist, and prophet of the new sustainable world network of vibrant local economies. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. See you next time.